Hi, everyone. My name is Albert Świdziński. Welcome to another Strategy and Future podcast. And with me today is Dr. Philip Carber, gentleman who everybody who watches our podcasts already know. We recorded a podcast about Proud Profit, which again last year, in which Dr. Carber was thoroughly involved, and it happened last year, June, I believe, um, when the first throes of Russian war against Ukraine ended. It was slowly entering more stable arrangement before NATO summit. And here we are just over a year later, again, just before NATO summit. And we're here today because we would like to speak with Dr. Carber on his most recent report, very aptly titled Quo Vadis, which of course is a reference to work by Henryk Sienkiewicz. So again, Dr. Carber, thank you for being with us.
Great, thank you, Albert. It's always fun.
So Doc, let's jump right into it. Let's start with a report that already saw is already in the public domain. It's being discussed, I believe, quite vigorously in Ukraine and other places around the world. If I may begin by asking, how and why at this point did you decide to release the report on this point? What is its goal and who is the co-author of the report?
So, my colleague and contributing author is Lieutenant General retired Trevor Cadeau, a Canadian three-star. By the way, a fantastic human being, and he right when the so my view, by the way, is the war against Ukraine started in 2014. So when we talk about the current part, it's the direct invasion. So within a month of the direct invasion, he, on his own initiative and at his own expense, came to Ukraine and basically volunteered his services. And he said, "I'll work as a rifle." Well, he said armor officer, so armor background. He said, "I'll be happy to work with your force." And they go, I'm sorry, you're a NATO three-star general. So he said, I'll go and do help wherever I'm needed. And as you know, the Ukrainians had just started a month before the attack, or January 1st, actually, creating their territorial forces, which were, caught in a terrible situation. And so he volunteered to go and ended up going to the front with, and then, of course, territorials are originally sort of designed to be more in the rear area, and all of a sudden they're getting thrown into the meat grinder, into the fray. And so he was up at the front with serving as a brigade advisor to all these territorial brigades, many of them having commanders who were not necessarily new, but I mean, they may have come out of retirement or had been lieutenant colonels or something. So, and as you know, I had spent uh, more time than I had planned. Now, some 90 some trips to the front since 2014,
If I could
uh,
interrupt for a second, I do believe there is a slide that includes a picture of both you and General Cardo,
yeah,
right?
yeah, put it up, yeah,
So if you don't mind me,
yeah,
I wouldn't mind showing to our audience this one right here. I'm not sure if it shows. I do believe it shows.
yeah. I
Uh,
can see it.
yeah.
So Trevor's the good-looking one in the gray sweater, and
Right.
on the other side, we're flanking Mamuka, who's the commander of the
Georgia.
Georgia Legion, and he's really one of the heroes of the first couple day defense of the Hostomel Airport in the northwest of Kiev. A great story, by the way. He and his guys had been in a training position a few kilometers away, and so they go running up to the thing. Well, all they had was one magazine worth of ammunition, and they get to the airport, and they're fighting with the Russian special forces, and and um, and they run out of ammunition. So he has a BMW, he gets in his BMW with a couple of his guys hanging whatever ammunition they have left, and he starts driving up and down the runway, running over Russian Spetsnaz guys with his car. Got a couple of them. So he's a gutsy guy. I've known him for a number of years. But here we are, shortly after, very early in the war. Flanking him, and so Trevor and I interviewed many commanders. We spent a lot of time with the troops in the field, and we had sort of a good combination because, as you know, I'd spent most of my, like during 2015 during the Debaltseve winter offensive, I was with every frontline brigade, and I'd been with a number of brigades both before then and 14 and since. So I had a pretty good set of relations with the regular army. And Trevor had, Fingerspitzengefühl on the feel of the fingertips from being with the Territorial. So we really had a kind of a synergistic relationship. So the Ukrainian General Staff asked if we would put together a report on Ukraine's armament needs. And we did. This is in the summer of 2022, and I presented it in Brussels to NATO at a NATO-sponsored event inside NATO headquarters, and it had a reasonable impact. And so last fall, the Ukrainians asked if we would again do a joint effort, and this time sort of focus on the question of NATO in Eastern Europe and Ukraine's potential role in NATO and so forth. And so that's the origin of the piece. In what was supposed to be sort of a 30-page report ended up being 155. But they then submitted it to NATO. And it's been passed around as of, I think, the 1st of July or something like that.
So very, very early on in the paper, if I could just interject,
yeah,
you go back to 2016 and how the storm clouds. I mean, I could even quote it because it's a valuable quote, where there was a book titled Rethink, Realign, React, and how it spoke of storm clouds gathering over Europe. And then you point out that clearly those storm clouds were not sufficiently motivating for NATO to develop a robust strategy to either inhibit Russia's imperial ambition or be militarily prepared if deterrence failed. So I think since then you go to Olaf Scholz's memorable speech and Zeitenwende, but it's hard to avoid, noticing that there is a lot of, they clearly talk the talk, but I think you recognize that, or there is a concern that insofar as Vulcan is concerned, there's still a lot to do, right?
So I'm sort of embarrassed because I think normally this is kind of bad form to quote yourself in your own report, but that first quote was from my report for the Polish Ministry of Defense for the Warsaw Ministerial. I'm sorry, for the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was published just before the ministerial. And I was kind of irritated because we say these things, but then and everybody talks deterrence. Oh, we're going to deter them. Oh, we're going to do this, and oh, we're going to do that. And the aggression just keeps on. And anything that is important to be done for Ukraine, it's amazing how much stuff has actually been done for Ukraine, but it's always a year or more too late. I mean, I started screaming about the need for Javelin in the summer of 2014. They don't arrive until 2017 or early 18. I mean, I can list system after system after system. A year ago, people said, oh, they'll never get Patriot. Well, then they start getting Patriot. And then, well, they'll never get F-16. Well, now I'm going to get it. the point is it's what's dragging this conflict out is NATO's inability to act decisively, and they're in this kind of minimalist approach. We call it prevarication, where you kind of just, well, yeah, we'll get there, and oh, yeah, we don't want to escalate, and some of it is absolute sophistry. For example, how is it that Russia can fire thousands of long-range missiles? I mean, we're talking about 7 to 2,000 kilometer range missiles, several thousand of them, from Russia and even over NATO airspace, and from the Black Sea, from Belarus, but somehow it's escalatory if the victim fires 5 kilometers into Russia. I mean, what sophistry is this? Albert Wolster used to have a phrase, American Strategies, maximum ways to confuse ourselves. And so part of my frustration over the last few years I felt like we really have been kind of tied up in our own self-restraint and constructs, and we needed to kind of have a different approach. So that was kind of the basis of it. And then as I was talking to Trevor and others, I found that a lot of people, so one of the great shibboleths, the Pope said this, oh, poor Russia, NATO threatened Russia. It's a NATO expansion.
It was interesting how I'm sorry for interrupting, but it was because again, I will now explain just for the sake of clarity that this is, I hope, and I do believe this is one of 2 conversations we're going to have, centered around the report. So this is more of an introductory conversation where we will go through the basics of it, the 5 chapters of it, and especially important. Again, I love the first chapters because I could feel your irritation when you were like laying the groundwork, explaining everything, how the force structure looked during the Soviet days, why it's still important. But the particularly important chapters from a strategic standpoint are 4th and 5th, I believe, especially the 5th, where you lay out your concept of how NATO should approach this problem. So this is the first conversation. But after the NATO summit, and after my boss Jacek returns from his travels, wherever those travels might have taken him, we'll have a sort of a 3-way conversation, if you will, where we both discuss the report, the finer points of it, and how the outcomes of the NATO summit.
So the reason I start with that is not to get tied down in the first couple chapters, but I think the ultimate strategic question is, did NATO pose a threat to Russia?
That's the thing. And
my argument is yes. But it wasn't a military threat.
Yeah.
There was a 2/3 of all the forces in Eastern Europe after joining NATO disappear. There aren't any big exercises, and those that are like medical stuff, or getting ready for guys to go to the work in the Middle East until 2019, when Putin comes back to power as national security head in Russia, and brings back the Zapad exercise, which had been abandoned since the 80s, which is the exercise which always was Soviet's exercise for the invasion of NATO. And he brings it back, and they do a test invasion of the Baltic, and then fire tactical nuclear weapons, and then they attack Poland and with nuclear weapons. And that was the most overt thing anybody did, right? So why do I say NATO was a threat? Because Putin's objective is, and it's become very clear now, is to restore the Russian Empire. Oh, well, where was that? Well, yeah, it was Russia, it was Ukraine, but it was also Finland, it was all the Baltic states, it was half of Poland, and you just keep going down around. If that is his program and his agenda, then NATO having these offering a security approach to these vulnerable countries. And remember, the original intent was to teach them how to both reduce the high cost of armament and by bringing them into NATO to teach them civil military relations and so forth. So yes, it was a threat because it threatens his imperial agenda. But it was not a military threat. The military threat starts with him. So anyway, I think it's really important to get that one right. And then when we go into the strategy, then the question is, all right, how do you address that imperial agenda?
So you begin with again, still first chapter, and the chapter again, as we when we spoke of the record of camera, I point out that for Soviet military art strategists, this is something that is probably well known, but for me it was a fantastic experience where you began with explaining how Soviet force structure was composed, right? Starting with military districts, going to fronts, going to armies, going to and at which of those were active during the peacetime and which of them became activated during wartime. And then you point out that this is important not only as a historical evidence, but also because this will still guide how Russian will reconstitute their force, right? In a way.
And I think it explains the poor performance that we've seen. So back in the Soviet Union, you had military districts. Then under those, you had major armies. And then under the armies, you had multiple divisions, and inside the divisions, you had regiments, so forth. They go from 28 armies down to 6 by the time Putin comes around. They went from 200 and some divisions to 10. They were trying to replace divisions with brigades, but they had only built up about 40 or so. Based on some tactics they developed in Chechnya, they developed this concept of a battalion tactical group. Why was that important? Because they wanted to use professionals, but half of their manpower was conscript. And they learned in the first Chechen war, you don't send conscripts. They don't want to be there. They're not well trained. They take disproportionate casualties. And oh, by the way, since they are conscripted from the general population, some of their mothers are important and they don't like losing their sons and they will scream and yell. So, but they couldn't afford to have an all professional force. So the idea was, okay, we're going to take 1/3 of the brigade plus some of the fire support and so forth, maybe use the brigade commander, the deputy commander, and he's going to run this battalion tactical group. Okay. So we're going to literally rip out the best part of a brigade. And so they practiced that in Chechnya with moderate results. But at least the second Chechen war, but at least the mothers stopped bitching. Then in Georgia, still not great, but it was improving. And so then they had the bright idea, okay, we don't need all these layers. So we're going to go from military district down to individual brigades, and then we'll piece these up. Mm. One Russian general back in the around I think it was in the Zapad exercise of 2009 said, I have 11 different, he was a military district. I got 11 different pieces there. I can't control 11 maneuver units all simultaneously, all in engagement. Then it kind of worked in Ukraine and kind of didn't. They found that they were vulnerable, for example, in late August, September of 14, when they had the breakthrough in the south and Zabrowski's counteroffensive cut them off. But they did rotate 70 of these battalion tactical groups over the course of the Ukraine conflict from 14 up until 19 or 20, rotating as far from the Far East, from the North. So they were getting experience and so forth. So somewhere around 2017, they start realizing we don't have enough. We have to fill in the gap. We have to have combined arms. We have to have support equipment, and so forth. So they started bringing back both divisions, and then bringing back armies. So they start bringing these back. Well, the problem is that when the Soviet Union had 28 armies, they had 5 million men under arms. Yeah. Well, now they have 1 million men under arms, and in that same period, Putin pulls 100,000 out of the ground forces to go into some kind of presidential security force. So it's even getting smaller, but they're trying to add more and more structure. So it's starting to look like kind of a Potemkin village. Mm-hmm. And then inside the armies, they felt good. They were going to have divisions. So on paper, it looked like an extremely strong force. But in reality, when you committed that force, there just wasn't enough experienced manpower to be able to implement complex operations. I'm not talking about, a slow-moving anti-terrorist counterinsurgency. We're talking about major combined arms warfare against a tough, if not big, opponent who also has some combined arms. So that I think is why it's really important to look at. So as we look at it, where did they go wrong? But then it's also important to understand what might they do to fix their problem, and how long would it take? Mm-hmm. And we already see them undertaking a number of initiatives, both not only larger mobilization, but creating a new military district, adding additional combined arms units, and so forth. So, that's why we spent the time and the effort on that. I'm sorry to go into it, but I think it's really important.
Oh yeah, I mean, two things. It was also very interesting how you described how battalion tactical groups tended to be understaffed in terms of infantry power, right? That they usually had manpower problems when it came to infantry. And also how because the beautiful part was where you described how, there is, of course, the chain of command and how different unit sizes increase, but this is only a part of the edifice, right? Then you have the entire logistics, you have training, you have the sort of and unless those things come together, it's a Potemkin village, right?
So the battalion tactical groups weren't necessarily a failed flaw or imaginary. They just didn't have enough. So you have 3 infantry companies. So they were on paper, they were enormously tough. You had a tank, say a tank company with manned by all regulars. You would have up to a battalion, maybe a battalion plus of artillery support, and several batteries of air defense. And those tended to be manned primarily by regulars, which meant, though, that given how few regulars there were in the brigade, the infantry line companies ended up being very light. You submit that guy into battle, he has nobody to protect his line of communication. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have the trucks to keep the flow going. Yeah. So they drive in, and they get to the outskirts of coming in from the east, not the north. They come in from the east. They get to the outskirts of Kiev, and they kind of go, well, hello, is someone going to bring us some fuel or some ammunition? Oh my God, the convoy just got ambushed by a bunch of farmers who are stealing our stuff. Mm-hmm. It was that weakness in the they had a impressive tooth to tail ratio. The trouble is that tail was too thin to support the teeth, and the teeth started falling out. Sorry for the analogy.
No. So there is that's the because again, you in certain detail describe how the operation looked, how Russia's war against Ukraine looked in chapter 3. Before we go to it, again, I really do love that quote. Again, going back to this force structure part, because it's in very simple language, one that one can understand. You really lay down the problem. For example, in Poland, we have a big problem with assent, or with people focusing on military characteristics of particular equipment. You know what I mean? And then there is the quote when you point out that force structure, the organization hierarchy of various units, is the skeletal sine qua non for creating modern combined arms ground force. So then there are different units, right, from companies to battalions, and divisions serving as a hierarchy of command combined arms and some support. The force structure not only creates an order of the battle for commitment to combat, but also incorporates the prequel and the dispensable necessities of training, leadership development, operational planning, maintenance, logistics support, and means of onward movement and deployment from peacetime garrison to front. Which again, we'll go back to this later on when we discuss chapter 4 and centers of gravity and the reception zone, stuff like that. To achieve its mission, a force structure requires established facilities, troop housing, barracks, maneuver training areas, sustainment nodes, effective lines of communication, adequate equipment stocks. But this edifice is hollow without a means of recruiting the troops to go into it, the industrial base to both arm and supply it, and the national infrastructure for its deployment. And then it also requires the strategic center of gravity, as you point out, the cohesion, right? When it comes to NATO, or it comes to some guiding idea. But excuse me for the interruption. I just really, really appreciate the quote. So chapter 3 goes into how Russia conducted its operation, right? Among three fronts: the Eastern Front, the Northern Front, and the Southern Front. Which were not created equal. Clearly, there were different outcomes to the operation. I'm not sure if we want to go into the detail of that, but if you could just say a few words, and then we could go to again, I think the key element of this chapter, that is your 3 potential scenarios for war termination, right?
So, just briefly, Russia starts the war with 12 armies, 2 in the Western Military District, 6th and 1st Guards Tank, 3 and the 20th, 3 in the Southern Military District, the 8th, 49th, and 58th. In the center, the old 2nd Tank Army, and the 41st, and then another 4 armies out in the Far East. When you look at, and a couple independent corps, one out in Sakhalin in the Far East, one at Kaliningrad, one up in the Arctic, and another in Crimea. When you look at it, 95% of that force ended up being committed to this campaign. It is unbelievable. Now, not all of those armies were committed equally. So like 1st Guards Tank and 20th and 8th, those were committed as whole armies, and each had several divisions and so forth. The ones from the Far East sent a half dozen battalion tactical groups that were kind of integrated. But it's amazing. For example, the 11th Corps in Kaliningrad, they moved the majority of that corps out of Kaliningrad, leaving virtually nothing to protect it, committed it to combat, and literally got it destroyed. I mean, the same with the Northern Corps. There's just shreds left. 1st Guards Tank Army, I mean, it was just eviscerated. Now they're trying to bring it back now.
In Belarus, right?
Yeah, supposedly they've moved it around to Belarus. Though it's hard to tell what games they're playing. By the way, and they've also brought back a 3rd army, which had played notionally, at least, in Zapad in 2017 and Zapad in 2021. Why is that important? At the end of the Cold War, or during the height of the Cold War, the Russians had 5 armies in East Germany: First Guards Tank, Second Tank, Third Shock, Eighth Guards Army, Combined Arms Army, and 20th Combined Army. All of those are disbanded. Putin starts bringing them back. First the 20th, then the First Guards, then the 8th Guards, then the Second Tank, which had been knocked down to a division. The one that was kind of missing was Third Shock. And now, so it's sort of interesting. Of 60 some armies that Russia used in World War II, whose honorifics and titles they could have picked for the main thrust for the operation, right? And they picked the 5 that were directed against NATO by Soviet Union. I don't think that was accidental. I'm not trying to overplay it, but I mean, it is kind of weird. I mean, it just is an interesting phenomenon. So those guys got pretty beat up. The problem in the north is Ukraine didn't mobilize. They were warned. They thought it was too expensive, and they didn't want to scare the people. Well,
yeah,
it's ended up being a hell of a lot more expensive than any mobilization. But that is so typical. You know, Roberta Wohlstetter wrote the classic book on Pearl Harbor and the implications of surprise, as has a number of people. And the interesting thing is the 73 war, Yom Kippur War is another example. It's not an absence of information. In most cases, Pearl Harbor, it wasn't an absence of information. It was an absence of, it was the fact that people had a mindset that it wouldn't happen, and they failed to react to the indications and warning. And I think that's an enormously important a lesson to learn. And Ukraine, unfortunately, paid a huge price. I said a couple of weeks before the war, if the Russians try and break through out of the Crimea Peninsula, the bodies will be stacked like cordwood. Because I'd been on those causeways with the units in 14. I knew how the trenches, the minefields, and how hard it would be to break through. Mm-hmm. You know, but it's not hard to break through when there's nobody there.
Yeah.
The same, you know. So
this is, I think, this. Excuse me for interrupting. The Southwestern Front is one of the few cases. Well, I mean, it's a case. I think it's a case study of where because I would imagine what Russians thought were, I don't know what they thought, but I can imagine that when they were planning this operation, it was less supposed to be military, it was less supposed to be full-scale war, and more of an intelligence operation, right? A shock and awe kind of deal, decapitation, but focus on intelligence. There was a RUSI report, Royal United Service Institute report, where they described how Russian security apparatus was prepared to manage the population, you know, target lists of important individuals.
But Albert, can I interrupt you for a second? I demur on calling it intelligence. It was an occupation. It was an attempt to do Novorossiya. The intelligence agencies would actually be doing the occupation, and the army was just kind of getting in there. Okay, but it wasn't. The purpose wasn't to collect intelligence. The purpose was to occupy what Putin called Novorossiya and knock out Kiev, in my opinion.
Sure, absolutely. And again, those measures largely worked down south, right? Where you had cases of treason, right? People were sentenced for that. But then,
I'm sorry.
Oh no, okay, so I'll continue. But then the chapter 3, if I just may return, continues with 3 scenarios for war termination. And you begin with describing the first scenario, which I'm afraid, unfortunately, aptly was called Ukrainian Miracle Victory. Which basically starts off at what happens if because this report was released, I believe, very late June, right? When Ukrainian offensive was already ongoing for the last couple of weeks.
We finished it on the 24th, and it was released publicly on the 1st.
On the 1st. So you begin with with positing question, what would happen if Ukrainians managed to break through Russian lines of defense, arrive at the shores of Sea of Azov, and then they are faced with a dilemma of whether they should go east towards Mariupol, right, or whether go west. So if you could give us a rundown of this scenario and the two other scenarios, which I think unfortunately are more likely, which is ugly Russian win, victory, and stalemate essentially, and preparation for the next war, continuation of the war.
So I'm not Nostradamus, so I can't predict. A number of my colleagues who I value very highly, I mean, General Ben Hodges, for example, is absolutely convinced that Russia's going to collapse. And, you know, the craziness going on with the Prigozhin thing kind of makes you at least wonder. But Russian troops have shown themselves. So it's important to realize, and even I, in the enthusiasm, I remember it was briefing NATO last summer, and the Polish tanks had just arrived, and I go, the operations were just beginning, and I go, you know, Polish tanks arrived just like the Polish cavalry at the gates of Vienna. And a little hyperbole, but I really felt it. And I was, had we given them between June and September the equipment we have given them since, I think they would have been able to keep that momentum. But I want to emphasize, that was not truly a counteroffensive. The Russians realized that they were overextended and they couldn't achieve, couldn't break into Kiev. So then they start running out, and some units got pretty beat up leaving, and they also left the last equipment. Kherson, I mean, those airborne units held Kherson for a very long time, and finally, when it became kind of untenable that the bridges were going to be gone and their support, the Russians started moving back out. Now, I'm not saying that it wasn't Ukrainian attacks that put pressure on them, but it wasn't like they broke through and forced them. So they were essentially chasing them back to the Dnieper. And then when you go to the Kharkiv, again, the Russians basically decided to fall back from Kharkiv to the Luhansk border area. And now now here the Ukrainians were chasing them like hell. And they overran them, you know, in a number of their units. I mean, overran a lot of equipment and assets and logistics support. But those weren't true counteroffensive, in the sense that you break through. So I think there's been a lot of, you know, heady optimism. Oh, gee, and then when it doesn't happen, there's this is no good and so forth. I think anybody's so Russian troops, when they're dug in, when they have substantial artillery support, and a fact that hardly anybody pays attention to, when the other side has total and complete air superiority. So the last guy to try a armored offensive without without at least in condition where the other side has air superiority was Erwin Rommel in the Battle of Alamein. And in his memoirs, he said, he has a great quote: "Modern armies cannot operate on the battlefield with the other side having air superiority." And he learned the hard way. So what's been happening in the southern, as the Ukrainians are trying to break down? So the infantry infiltrates, they get the engineers to deal, you get a couple paths, and you're ready to go, right? And so I diddle, you get you guys out of assembly areas, and they're not concentrated heavily because of the drone issues. So they're dispersed, so all of a sudden they start falling in, and here you're going in a pretty fast road march, and all of a sudden, a couple of vehicles take a KA attack helicopter hits. And then the next thing, you got Su-25s coming down the road strafing or with rockets. And that has happened numerous times in the counteroffensive.
Yeah. And this is also something that didn't happen this much before, right? But this is a consequence of depletion of surface to air, right?
Well,
Assets.
so it's not just a depletion, but well, there's a couple of things. One, it didn't happen before because the Russian close air support doesn't work very well. So it works best when there's fixed lines.
Mm-hmm.
And your troops are dug in, and you can kind of see it coming, and you have time to come in and augment the aerial artillery, augment the thing, but with a little bit more depth. Secondly, the air defenses. So Patriot has worked beyond everybody's imagination. Okay? For most of the conflict so far, there's been 2 batteries, and they're situated around Kiev. Makes sense. The problem is when the other guy is throwing a whole bunch of stuff to try and take out Patriot batteries, from everything from ballistic missiles, which Patriot can take care of, long-range cruise missiles, okay, drones. I mean, literally the kitchen sink. You end up taking what air defense systems you have, the lower, and you have literally a hierarchy of air defense systems. You know, short range, medium range, and all clustered around the Patriot because you got to protect those Patriots. Well, then you look, you say, well, where are the tactical air defense systems that to protect the ground forces? Oh, there's a couple units over here and a couple. When you have 12 brigades for on a counteroffensive, and you have only a half dozen mobile air defense systems for them, it's not enough. It's not enough. So that's why it is so damn important to have Ukrainian have fighters, because they wouldn't be able to do that stuff if there was even just a couple of fighters that could come in and they don't have the dog. Well, first of all, an F-16 will tear up an Su-25, but all an F-16 has to do is do a flyby, and the 25 is going to drop his bombs and run home because he knows he's not going to win that fight. And that's why it's so criminal for Ukraine not to have any kind of air assets. The same, by the way, I recently put together some data. So let me ask you a question. Let's play a game. Because I was sort of surprised. How many attacks on Ukrainian population areas since the beginning of this war, this year? So just the last 6 months. How many have been conducted, you think, by bombers flying over Ukraine territory, not firing remote stuff from?
Well, bombers, like you mean strategic or Su-34s?
Anything you can drop a bomb.
Probably very few, right? Most of them were launched from Belarus or Russian territory, no?
What's your guess? Well, my guess was 200.
I'd say less, probably double digits.
2,300. I was off by a factor of 10. Yeah.
2,300. 2,300.
100.
Huh.
Yeah. The sorties against Ukrainian ground forces by Russian tactical aviation, frontal aviation, as fixed wing and not just Su-25s, but also some of the bombers. I mean, some of the larger fighters carrying bombs is up 20% just in the last 4 weeks of the counteroffensive.
Yeah.
So when people go, oh, gee, I don't understand. Well, I'll tell you why it's hard. Let me explain it to you. You sit there on your hands and you sit there and debate and whine and oh this and oh that, and you nickel and diamond. And if I'm going to get some F-16s, if they started the pilot training in March of 22, when it became apparent that much of the Air Force was not going to survive the war, You would have F-16s flying now, right?
Yeah.
Um, and if it's not irate, I am in the sense that I'm tired of people going around and both being critical of. So anyway, it's challenging. It's very challenging. Uh, so that doesn't mean that at some point the Russian troops may break. So if they break, then I think that Ukraine can get down to the Sea of Azov, which is critical because it cuts that line. And then I think they do have a choice point to make, and you can make the argument kind of equally both ways. I don't think Crimea is. I like the deal of standing off and beating the hell out of Crimea with if they had attack them, or even if they get closer with HIMARS, because there's relatively few positions in Crimea. You can make it militarily untenable without having to break through the causeway line, and then you still have to do the breakthrough into Sevastopol. I mean, go back to World War II. That either for the Germans to take it originally or the Russians to retake it. Those were long, bloody, huge battles, and then to be able to carry the battles still further out to the Kerch Peninsula. So I tend to think that now the counter to that argument. So I tend to say you can probably make more time or by swinging in the Donetsk. Essentially replicate Zabrowski's original raid, but this time do it with, 3 or 4 brigades, not one. And so you swing in behind and cut off Donetsk and go to Luhansk, and then you can possibly link up with guys coming from the north across Luhansk and basically get them in the bag. The downside of that one is the closer you get to the Russian border, the more their support is working, the more their assets can flow in, and the more strung out and vulnerable you are. So this is not a cakewalk. In terms of the other two sort of options, which one do you want to talk about?
Yeah. I'll begin that with another quote, which sums up the Ukraine miraculous victory, and it says, no matter how motivated the army to expel the aggressors, there are physical realities which, if not addressed with Western military aid, may exhaust Ukrainian ability to continue counteroffensive action, right? And this is where we get into the disproportion in potential, materiel, and manpower, really, which brings us to scenario number 2, which is Russian ugly win.
So I think it goes back to Thucydides, but there's a saying that democracies don't do long wars well. And you can find comments disparaging long wars from Sun Tzu to Machiavelli and so forth. Why? Because in a long war, they either lose a democracy or they lose the war, and not infrequently they lose both. Athens in the Peloponnesian War is a classic example. It's just so much tolerance that democracies can put up with for a long bleeding struggle, and then they get frustrated and they want to change the leadership and so forth and so on, and and then all of a sudden you're.
Do you think that's also a threat for Ukraine at this point in time, or do you mean predominantly West? Because that's a.
Well, I was thinking of specifically Ukraine, not today, but okay. So what if we're in a situation? The front really hasn't moved in 8 months, right? Since the Kherson and Kharkiv operation. Lost a little bit, gained a little bit. What if it's sitting there another 8 months? It's not blitzkrieg, it's sitzkrieg. A friend of mine has a Ukrainian battalion, and he goes, yes, we are inflicting somewhere between 5, depending on the day, and so but we're inflicting between 5 and 10 casualties for every one we take. Okay. So I have 500 guys in my battalion. Um, and over a period of time, we inflict 2,500 casualties on the other side. But then I don't have anybody left in my battalion. Now, nobody's going to run their battalion all the way down, but his point was, people tend to say, "Oh, look how much we're killing." Well, yeah, but how much? And Ukraine has lost a substantial number of its most experienced troops and commanders. Now, yes, guys in the territorials, yes, guys who from the reserves who came in. If they survive, they're learning, and they're getting good. But that bleeding is very impactful, and it's more evident to the Ukrainian population than it is to people in Russia. So yeah, Russia can have 10 times the casualties, but if people don't know about it, they don't get your son's dead. They go, Ivan is having important missions, not to mention how many millions of people are out of their country or internally displaced, and the impact that has on families and troop morale. I'm not doing anything to disparage it, the Ukrainian thing. I'm just saying, walk in their shoes. Just walk in their shoes. And you can't help but be concerned that if this thing it isn't ended sooner rather than later, they wouldn't be human and a democracy if the frustration didn't start showing up.
The only counter I could offer to this is the history of like coercive air campaigns, like strategic bombing during World War II. Terror bombing of London, or even the German air campaign during Warsaw Uprising. Those things, when they are directed at general population, they usually don't produce willingness to. They don't have the coercive effect. They.
No. So, but Albert, I wasn't talking about the coercive effect on the population. I'm talking about the population's frustration with their own losses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so in the first year of the war, Ukraine lost the equivalent of 10 years GDP.
Yeah.
Excuse me, 1 year of GDP, which at a minimum would take them 10 years to recoup. Now, my guess is that it's going to be another year's worth of GDP the second year. So, okay, then it's another 20, that's 20 years. The effect of that is cumulatively is just high. Again, they've shown resilience, and I'm the last person to cast any aspersions on their potential and not only their past performance but their commitment. I'm just saying, I think every society has a breaking point. I don't know where theirs is, but I think we would be really stupid to pretend that they're going to do this for another 10 years, and Ukraine will be the same. So you pick the date. I don't care, but I think there's a danger of that. But by far but for me the biggest danger is if sort of those first two options don't happen. So if the Ukrainian counteroffensive isn't as successful as people hope, and if the Russians don't have an ugly win, and we end up getting in a stall, and then every happy politician in the West or presidential candidate is going to come up with a peace plan. Oh, so let's see, who do we have already? We got Xi, we have the Pope, we have the South Africans. So I don't want to say the Pope is a Russian sympathizer, but it so happens they all have the same message, right? Yeah. And just think about what that does. And then I don't ever want to hear somebody talk about deterrence, because Russia can play that game. What's yours what's mine is mine, and what's yours is negotiable. And then they'll turn around and they'll play it. It's just an invite. We saw that for the last 7 years prior to the war, right? So that for me is the worst of all worlds.
Yeah.
Because it not only bleeds Ukraine, it ends up not being decisive. It sends a terrible message in terms of the Russian leadership, because it reinforces their belief that they can just outlast them. And it brings out the worst in us in the West.
Yeah.
Because you have kind of people, oh, we have to stop the fighting. So I'm going to come in with my peace plan.
Yeah. And this is happening a lot right now. There were news hitting the information hitting the news cycle just a couple of days back of back channel discussions, right, between well, not active but former U.S. Personnel with Russians. But also this there was a very interesting thing when you predicted when you stated that for Russia to reconstitute its force and capability might take 12 to 18 months, right? And taking into account that Ukraine will, if the war doesn't conclude in a stable arrangement, Ukraine will be uninvestable, right? So any idea of rebuilding that country, you will just not find the capital willing to risk. So that means the stakes are very well, they're stacked against, right? Ukraine, the chances, right?
Well,
If
so the West has the power in it. If it decides to, if it recognizes, and amazingly, a lot of people do now, even compared to a year ago, that Putin's objective is to extend the Russian Empire, and it isn't. This isn't just about Ukraine,
sure.
and no, it's not just about NATO scary and blah blah. But just look inside NATO for a second. Why can't Sweden and Ukraine join NATO?
Yeah.
Because Turkey is sabotaging Sweden, and Hungary is sabotaging Ukraine. I believe both of those countries would be in this at this deal if it wasn't for this country. You say, oh well, we have to unanimity. Well, who says? Yeah. That may have made sense when you had the original founding members, dozens. So, but when you have 30 some, anybody can throw a black ball in the thing and prevent action. So you say, well, what do we do about that? Well, not doing something about it is the disgrace. So there are things one can do. One could put pressure on them. Hungary does not have to receive US, EU, or NATO aid. Hungary does not have to be part of intelligence sharing. Their military don't have to be invited to NATO commands. I think there might be a better chance to have between Sweden and Turkey, maybe, because Turkey is focused on a very, very narrow issue, but an issue that's important to them and would have been to us, after during the war on terror. But Hungary is just so. I looked into it, and this is going to be controversial. You'll probably never have me back. There's a solution to the problem. You can, the existing members.
I know where you're going with that. Sure.
Can vote to end the organization, and Turkey and Hungary can't stop it. And so on the 11th, you disband the organization. On the 12th, you start it up again. The same headquarters, the same thing. It's just those two are no longer there. It's extreme, but if you think about it, those two countries, for their own little idiosyncratic. Turkey at least has a cause. Erdogan is just doing Putin's work, and I don't mind saying it. I'm not saying he's Putin agent, but he might as well be. I mean, the guy is on the record of saying that the United States is one of his top three enemies. They go, what the hell are you doing in this alliance? Go on the other one. You know? Um, that you can't sacrifice everyone else's collective security for fairly trivial national purposes. You can, but then I'm sorry, the rest of the alliance doesn't have to have you in it.
So, next chapter coming, because I know we have to. Well, I don't want to go into detail over chapter 4, which basically lays out the requirements when it comes to rearming Ukraine, because you point out that Ukraine, no matter what happens, will not be able to rebuild its industrial base to rearm itself for predictable future, and not to the extent that would be required to deter Russia.
Well, just let me just caveat there. Ukraine has a substantial armaments industry. They just chose, even during the war, even though during the 7 years between 14 and 21, they just chose to use their armament to make money for the state.
Sure.
So, did you realize that the Ukroboron, I used to call it porn because I thought it was pornographic, that they were doing their efforts to sell arms to the third world and not focused on arming their own country.
Yeah.
And why? Because they were actually paying more to the government, to the Ukrainian government, in taxes than they were getting orders from the Ministry of Defense. So yeah, okay, and then you're going to turn around and whine and cry about not getting enough from us. So, but they have changed that. I think they've learned their lesson. Fair enough. Again, I don't want to beat them up right now. The Russians are doing plenty of that, and either on the readiness prior to the war or this. I think they have learned their lesson, and I think they've got really strong leadership. So, and they're now trying to. So there are a lot of things. They are now the most integrated NATO country in armaments that exists because they have virtually a weapon from every country.
Sure, and able to run them, which is a feat in its own right.
Yeah. Whether they can maintain them, and you know, I mean, and as parts, but their industry has a lot to offer, particularly in reducing the price of a number of military issues. So if you take a European technology and you combine it with Ukrainian people who can do production, you can create more affordable armaments for countries that otherwise couldn't afford it. For example, the Baltic republics. Excuse me, the Baltic states. So I think there are a number of synergistic things that can be done with the armament. I just don't think that's going to happen in the foreseeable period where they can become anywhere close to being self-sustainable. Afterward, yes.
I'll give you, well, you know, first off, I thought about all the Stugnas that were meant for Arab markets, right? And then still being used in Ukraine. I don't know if you saw all the videos with Stugna cam being recorded with Arabic script on the screen. But the other thing is,
I fired it. I personally fired the Stugna. There's a photograph of me firing the Stugna.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was T90 at the other end, at the business end of the Stugna. But let's not get into that. One little side note. I don't know if you know, but Poland did a very similar thing with selling its military equipment abroad before World War II. We sold significant amounts of equipment, and it was a tragically, well, obviously very misguided decision. But that's just a byline.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, a lot of it. Spanish Civil War. We sold a lot of our stuff. We even sold the bombers. We had a pretty decent bomber that we were trying to sell everywhere. What can I really say? But the other thing is, when you speak of Ukrainian industrial capacity or military industrial capacity, the question I have is whether the West actually, because if you look at what West could do right now, I mean, Poland is with fanfare stated that will produce 200,000 155 millimeter rounds, which is very nice. But this is about what, 3 days, 4 days of use that of the use the Russians had at height of their volley of fire operations. Do you think the West would be able to actually, even if there is resolve, not just Titan vendor talk, but actual resolve?
Hmm.
Would there be actual physical capacity to improve, to increase industrial production in time?
Yeah. Um, Initially, so I have a phrase: it's important to play smart, not rich. Initially, I think you need to play rich, not smart. And what I mean by that is there are still some significant Western systems and technologies that are available in stocks that could be used.
Mhm.
Um, it might cost some, but they already exist. So let's just take the topic of the day, DPICM. So dual purpose improved conventional munitions, or otherwise known as submunitions. So never has a press story had such absence of useful information. For example, most stories don't point out the Russians have been using them since the summer of 2014. I came back in the summer of 14 with documented evidence. I mean, I personally picked the stuff up and took pictures of it and brought it back to the U.S. or to U.S. officials. So you say so, and then there was an article that came out the other day. Oh my heavens! Just a year ago, we were calling it a war crime. Now we're giving it to them. So let's just think about that for a second. I'm going to give you two examples. Yes. What are war crimes? War crimes are what the international community agrees to. And issues limitations to reduce suffering on the battlefield, or soldier suffering, and the damage to civilians. A classic example was the dum-dum bullet. So we have Full Metal Jacket because we don't have exploding units. Now, it kind of seems a little bit ridiculous today because how many ways can you kill that infantryman? But the dum-dum rule still exists, okay?
Yeah, which is absolutely insane because in many ways it's more humanitarian, right? I mean, you take a guy out or you increase a chance of fragmentation rather than, poke a bullet through him. It's insane, but
I've been shot once, and all I can say is being shot. Frankly, I don't think it matters which. But anyway, but it is right. So in the night after World War I, with air power just coming on, the international community said. So Duhay had written his big piece on air power, and people were aghast. No, population areas cannot be subject to aerial bombardment, right? And it was a general. You could have written an article for, people did, arms control today of the period, and said, yeah, there's an international norm. And then along comes German bombing of Guernica, and the Japanese bombing numerous Chinese cities, but not the least of which was was as part of the rape of Nanking. Maybe both of those countries, in retrospect, are sorry they did it, because we ended up bombing the hell out of 66 German cities.
oh yeah, Bomber Harris, sure.
No, in Germany.
I know Bomber Harris.
Well, yeah, but the 20th Air Force under Harris burnt down 33 Japanese cities, including a couple nukes. So, what is a war crime? If the opponent is violating the norm,
Yeah.
and he's attacking you, you are not under an obligation to follow that norm, because that's the sure way to suicide.
Sure.
Right? Now we'd always. So by the way, Princess Di and everybody, and I'm all in favor of reducing the collateral damage and damage to civilians. But when you have neither Russia nor China signing up to get rid of submunitions, the United States actually. So why did I say we have to play rich, not smart, right? Because we sold. So listen to this one. Oh, we got to get rid of DPICM because it's a moral issue. Okay. Did we demill it? No. We sold it to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So, wait a minute. If it's immoral, so I don't even want to walk down that path. But so now what are we doing? We're buying it back so we can give it to the Ukrainians, and they need it. And I don't mean to make it humor. This is the sheer absurdity of some of our positions.
Sure.
But that's a clear example. We've talked about GBU bombs. I think it's the
DPICM.
Yeah. F-16s. And go down the list. The United States has go to Google Earth and look up Sierra Army Depot. It's in Nevada.
Sure. The boneyard, yeah.
And there's an aerial view of a couple thousand, or at least the last time I looked, a couple thousand M1 tanks, 500, 155, and there's a place in the East Coast. We have a similar lineup of Bradleys. Now, okay, some of them are beat up. Some of them have been bastardized for part. That the ability to deliver that there's a hell of a lot more of that could be sent to Ukraine. And you turn around and say, okay, well, how much of that stuff do we have in the National Guard? A lot. So most of our Avengers, for example, are in the National Guard. The air defense system mounted on a Humvee. Well, while we're waiting to build more Avengers, why couldn't we give the Ukrainians those Avengers? It's not like the National Guard. I'm not demeaning them, but it's not like they're on the front line of forward defense.
Sure.
And then you backfill it with production there. And instead, there was this absurd decision. I don't know if it's still being followed or not. Oh, well, we'll eventually give Ukraine M1 tanks, but we have to go into new production. And you go, have you lost your freaking mind?
No.
You have hundreds of M1s pre-stocked in stockish positions on the German-Dutch border and I believe in Poland. All right, I'm not saying empty all of them, but you can have several brigades worth of those that could go to the Ukrainians right now, and then you backfill those out of National Guard or units in the Colorado or something, because under no conceivable circumstance in the next year are we going to use all of the conventional weaponry in the United States active in National Guard in the United States. It's a huge inventory. Yeah. Plus, there's all kinds of reserve stocks. Anyway, that's my point. I just think it's we've sort of and you don't have to do a lot of that. You do not have to do a lot of that. I sat down with some Ukrainian officers and calculated what do they need for air defense for their counterattack force. It's less than 100. So you combine some Avengers, somebody else, this SA-8s running around some countries. There's ZSU 23-4s. There's a lot of stuff, and it just that's not an undoable number. And they already have the experience of using them, so there's not a long spin-up time.
But I have a feeling that both, I have a hunch that both concerns about international law and, worrying about emptying stocks is really sort of, the saying that hypocrisy is a tribute that vice pays to virtue, right?